Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Asian Fantasy Fiction Podcast. I am your host, Jeremy Bai, also known online as Deathblade. I am a writer and translator who specializes in Chinese fantasy genres, and you can find my latest project, The 9 Heavens and 10 Earths, which is a novel series. It's currently on Amazon. But enough about me. Let's get to today's guest. Today's guest, we have an artist, and this artist has worked with me in the past. We'll get into that later. Her name is Xiao. She was actually born in Shanghai, China, moved around a lot in childhood, including countries in Europe, the US, and Canada. She's a concept art student, and her hope is to eventually design for AAA games. You can find her online as Xiao Fanchuan Art, including on ArtStation or on Instagram. And her current major project is a webtoon called Chroniclers, which is a horror xianxia, and it's very cool. We'll also get into that. Before we do all of that interesting stuff, though, I would just like to say welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's my first time doing anything like this, so thank you for taking a risk on me.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you. We have worked together quite a bit in the past, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we do, tell me a little bit about yourself. What was it like growing up in Shanghai and then moving around so much? Is that an experience that you enjoyed? Is it something that you wish could have gone a little bit differently? How was that?
I'd say, like everything else in life, it's got its pros and cons. I actually didn't stay very long in Shanghai. I was there for probably around 3 years of my life. And then I moved to Germany, and then to Sweden, and then to New York, and then up to Canada. So I got a lot of exposure to a lot of different cultures and different languages and different ways of doing things. So I like to think that I'm pretty open-minded to different experiences, and I like learning new things. But at the same time, it absolutely sucked because I had no friends.
I kind of can relate because my son similarly grew up in China up to about 3 and then left. He's only 5 now, so it's not as though that much time has gone by, but that transition of leaving and going somewhere else leaves you kind of without friends. What about on the language side? How did that affect you? Was it so for instance, your Chinese, your English, do you speak other languages as well in addition to those two?
Mostly I speak English and Chinese. I did learn a little bit of Spanish and French here and there, but I can't say I'm fluent in them. I've completely forgotten all of my Swedish. So, I would say most comfortable in English and Chinese at this point. But other than that, because of the language barrier in the first couple of months to a year that I spent in a new country, that made it even harder to make friends. So, again, loner kid who just sat there and drew pictures.
Well, speaking of pictures, how did you get onto this path of becoming an artist? Was that something that you knew you were going to do from early on, or was it more of a discovery over time?
I think I just always really liked to draw. So if I was sitting at the dinner table, I would start drawing, which is not good. Don't do that, kids. But I would sit in my room and just draw pictures. It was just something that I really liked doing. I would doodle in class. My notebooks are horrendous. They're covered in doodles. So I think it was just sort of the natural thing to do. And at a certain point, when I was around 8 years old, I asked my mom to enroll me in actual art classes. So I've been taking a lot of art classes just on the side. And I was like, hey, you know what? I think I'm just going to do this.
Were your parents supportive of the professional, of making that a professional goal? And I asked that with curiosity because I also went to art school and I majored in media arts and animation, and I have mixed feelings about that looking back. And of course there were also a lot of students that, like, I have students, former fellow students who I'm friends with on Facebook, some of whom actually ended up going down the path of becoming professional artists. Others did not. So how was your experience in that regard? Were your parents happy to see you pursuing it?
I think my answer there is just going to be I have Asian parents. So a little bit of resistance, but I think they've come around to it at this point. They're they're a little bit more open-minded at this point. But yeah, I have Asian parents.
Right. Yeah, that does explain that explains a lot. At what point? So if you started taking classes at 8, at what point were you producing stuff that you would consider like above and beyond what your peers are capable of?
Depends on who you're comparing yourself to, you know?
Yeah, I get it. Because I was in a similar situation where I always was kind of artistic, and then my parents were always, praising my art and stuff. But I felt like it probably, for me personally, it wasn't until maybe high school where I was actually able to produce content that was like really amazing for my age. I've seen your work. Well, obviously, you've done work for me on the cover of Sage Monarch and other things. You're in school. You're still in school, but you're already producing professional level work, and you're making money at it, doing commissions and whatnot. So was it in high school or college that you really felt like you ascended to the level of being either professional or quasi-professional?
To be honest, I still don't feel like I'm pro, and I get dumped on a lot by a lot of people for saying that, but I legitimately don't feel like I'm good enough, which I think is speaks to sort of how you are your own worst critic. Yeah, there are a lot of points where I feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. So that's really hard to say. It depends on who you're comparing yourself to and sort of what peers you're talking about. Because clearly, if there's a prodigy, right, and you compare yourself to the prodigy, you're not going to be doing so great. But if you're going to compare to somebody who maybe just picked up a pencil maybe last year or 2 years ago, then you're probably better than them. But I think in the end, it just comes down to mileage. And at a point where I could actually say that I was okay and pretty good was when I started after high school, I think.
Cool.
That's my opinion.
Cool. I mean, I think that's probably a sentiment that a lot of creative people share, is that you're always not happy with your current work and wanting to get better. And, whether it's my translations, my writing projects, or back when I was focusing on art specifically, I was kind of the same way as well. So I totally get it. Let's talk a bit about some of your projects that you either have worked on or have been working on. And we'll get to your webtoon in a second. Why don't we start with the covers? I know you've done Wuxia World covers. As of us recording this podcast, I'm not going to release it for a little bit later. But as of recording, I just talked with Etvaler, and I think you've done some covers for her. You've done covers for me. How many total covers have you done at this point? Do you know offhand?
Oh, I'd have to go and count, but yeah, I've done quite a few of them.
Have you learned anything during that process, or has it just been kind of like banging out content as requested?
It's a learning process. Every cover is a learning process because a lot of things it's just content from the novels, and I unfortunately don't have time to read them. So a lot of asking questions, going back and forth. But yeah, it's a learning experience from the beginning, because a lot of my normal illustration stuff is more, it looks more keyframe, like movie keyframe, and it's there's also a lot of concept art that I do versus book covers, and the compositions in book covers are actually quite different. So it's been a very cool learning experience. I learned a lot.
Do you have a favorite so far that you've done? You don't have to answer. If you people ask that to me of certain things, and I often am like, don't have an answer.
It's very hard to say, because I think when I execute on certain things, I really like how I did this aspect of this thing, but then I'll look at it again and say, hey, but I think I could have done this better. So it's a mixture of, yeah, okay, cool, learning experience, mileage, okay, let's move on kind of thing. So I don't really have a favorite, no.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about, because while I have done some cover art with you, I don't think, let me think for a second, no, it's not on the Wuxia World side. And so I'm curious your take on balancing the accuracy and the continuity of the original material with your artistic vision. What I mean is, sometimes in the covers we're depicting specific characters or specific scenes, and as the translator on my side, I'm thinking about all the little details that I know from the story and trying to fit them into the cover. And then I have the artist trying to take all those elements and trying to make something that looks good. And then I also have my boss, Ren, the owner of Wuxia World, chiming in with like, oh, well, this needs, this aspect needs to be different, or this aspect isn't working. How do you balance all that? What are your thoughts about that?
I think ultimately, like working as an artist, the only things that I like to sort of opine on are more of the technicalities in art, because a lot of times translators and editors don't have an art background. So things like composition, color balance, color theory, values, etc., that's not in their everyday lexicon. So I think it's part of my job to communicate to them, like, hey, if we want to fit all those things in this cover, it's going to be kind of a mess. So
Yeah.
is there a way we can, cut down to just these 3 or 4 elements that are the most important in this section, and just focus on these things? And so sometimes there's a bit of bargaining, sometimes there's discussion, and then I'll whip up some thumbnails and go with the one that they're happy with. So I think communication is really important, and what I bring to the table is the technical art stuff, and they bring all the story elements and so forth.
That makes sense. I know exactly what you're talking about. In one of the covers we were working on for one of my projects, A Will Eternal, not with you, with a different artist, the Ren, the owner of Wuxia World, kept talking about the color contrast. And he was like, the color contrast we need to have better color contrast and stuff. And so the artist was like playing with the colors, like the reds here and blues there or whatever, and kept making all these variations. And in the end, the problem was that Ren wasn't actually talking about the color contrast. He was just talking about like the general contrast of the entire piece. And so we went back and forth for probably like a couple of weeks just because we weren't on the same page with the terminology. Have you ever had that problem specifically? Like you're saying one thing and they don't understand what you're talking about?
Yes, I have. I actually have. I think one thing that sticks in my mind is the way that I like to light scenes is I choose sort of a colored light, or I'll choose a neutral light, and then the whole scene is lit in that color because it just feels more natural to me. That's just my preference. And sometimes I think especially in the Chinese market, there's a lot of art that's kind of like got 3 different light sources, that's like one's purple, one's green, and the other one's blue. I don't know if you've noticed that, but a lot of game splash art looks like that. So sometimes it's like, oh, can we have like, blue, green, red, and like gold and all sorts of different colors? And I'm like, yeah, if I just use a red light, everything is going to be sort of red. So can we decide on sort of what the lighting's going to look like before I start painting this thing? So yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. And Instant, I want to jump in here. I am recording this in my home office, and my neighbor has like one of the loudest trucks ever and is just turning it on to go to his work. So if that picks up in the background, I apologize. Let's talk for a second about your webtoon, Chroniclers. I love the art on it, and I just think it looks so cool. Where did you come up with the idea for it, and how has it been working on that project for? I think you've been doing it for a year and a half or more at this point. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, it's been about a year and a half where I actually did art for it and posted art for it. But it's actually been sort of in the works for about a decade.
Wow.
This character started out as more of just OCs that, a kid would have in their dreams or in their daydreams to go on imaginary adventures kind of thing. But I think over the years and through my life experiences, I've come up with more and more scenarios and more sort of plot points for them. And eventually 2 or 2.5 years ago, I decided, hey, like, let's just put everything into a story. And so I started writing, and it took me an entire year to write the whole thing. And after that, I started doing the art, and now I'm actually publishing chapters. So that's yeah. It's been.
So you wrote
the
whole thing before starting the art. Wow.
Almost. Like I don't have all the details planned out except for the first arc. But I did plan out the entire plot. Yeah.
Okay. So for people who haven't checked it out or aren't familiar with it, in a few sentences or so, what is the point of the of the webtoon, the
Right.
idea?
It is, well, the way the story is put together is if you were to imagine a Demon Slayer plus Inuyasha plus Mononoke meets Lovecraft meets wuxia is sort of what it is.
That sounds cool.
Thank you. And overall, it's really an exploration of humanity. It's an exploration of social issues, of human nature, of the goods and the bads, and the story around it is just has a lot of fantastical elements in it. But in the end, it's a human story, and that's really it.
What has been the most challenging or difficult aspect of the project that maybe you did anticipate or maybe you didn't anticipate?
Time. I wish
How
I
long
had
did,
more time.
right.
Sorry, go
How
ahead.
long does it how much time do you spend into how much time do you spend on it for each segment?
A long time, because the art that I put out is more quality over quantity, and the whole goal of it was also to challenge myself to draw different compositions and different angles. So I try not to take shortcuts with it, and it takes me a long time. It takes me at least a month to put one together. So yeah, with homework and commissions and work, it's just insane, and I wish I had more time to work on it.
How long do you think it's going to take you before you finish it?
Oh, years, but it's okay. It can be my ongoing side project.
Yeah. Cool. One thing I'm curious about, because I mean, the reason as I'm thinking about it, I honestly can't remember how you caught my attention. I'm thinking it was probably on Twitter, and usually what I do on Twitter is when when artists catch my eye who seem to have an understanding of Chinese culture, basically, that comes across in the art. That kind of jumps out to me because it's kind of hard a lot of times. Western artists who aren't familiar with, ancient Chinese history or wuxia, xianxia, and stuff like that, I waste so much time trying to explain it to them that it's not worth it. I'd rather have somebody that knows what I'm talking about before I get into the description of the actual piece that I'm looking for. I think that's how you caught my attention. How do you, how much of your work goes into things like research in terms of costumes or cultural elements, or does that stuff just come naturally because of the way you were raised?
I do try to do some research, especially if I'm trying to start a new piece. But a lot of it has to do with how I grew up. I mean, I am Chinese, so I speak Chinese at home. My parents are pretty Chinese. And also just the stuff that I loved watching growing up. I loved watching wuxia. I love watching mostly like old school pian. Oh, geez, what is that in English? Like kung fu movies and kung fu dramas, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So it was just a part of my life, and then like later on, I developed more of an interest in the actual history of it. So I went digging, and I got a whole bunch of I watched a lot of history documentaries. Um, Went to museums, a lot of places. Like actually just saw the stuff. And so it's sort of just built into my brain at this point. And the only research that I do need to do sometimes is just to remind myself of what these things look like. And really that's about it. Yeah.
Cool. That's kind of what I expected, and that's one of the reasons why I try to find artists such as yourself who kind of have it built in, so to speak, and not something that's been acquired externally. Let's talk about pet peeves, whether it's your own work or whether it's the work of others or whatever. What kind of pet peeves do you have to deal with in being an artist?
Sometimes it's hard when I guess sometimes an audience may not be as familiar with the genre or with whatever it is I'm doing, and anything that like things that I put out, people will say, "Hey, it looks like XYZ," and then I would be like, "Well, okay, but no, not really," and no, it's also my concept. So sometimes that kind of is like a little bit of a pet peeve because it's like, well, I spent like 10 years or 2 years or however much time on actually doing the concept for this, or if it's just a standalone piece, then I spent a week researching this thing and putting things together. So thank you, but also no thank you kind of thing. I think that goes for a lot of designers in that it's like, oh, when you say that, it kind of feels like your idea is not as original as it should be, kind of thing. It's like, okay, should I go back and redo this then? Kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I think something that plays into this whole sort of thing is that the past roughly, I would say 5 years or so has seen this huge surge of interest in specifically, I think, xianxia and xuanhuan, to some extent wuxia as well, both in terms of the online novel translations and also on the TV dramas, like the fact that you can go onto Netflix and get tons of these, high production value, like the Untamed or whatever. It's way more accessible, and I personally have seen an explosion in the fandom. But I think the number of people coming in who it's caught their eye and they think they're interested in it does not match who actually know about they're looking at. I think it kind of goes to what you're talking about, where they'll see things they don't even really know, and that kind of affects their judgment in terms of the comments they're leaving or the questions they're asking. I'm kind of thinking that has something to do with it. That's just
and I agree. And I think it's like if you go back 50 years in America, and like all Asians look the same because you only know freaking 2 Chinese people. Duh, they look the same. Well, if you only know 2 series, no duh, everything's gonna look the same.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I know Dragon Age and I know Baldur's Gate. Everything looks the same. Well, yeah, everything's based on Tolkien. Thanks. Go back and like look at the years and years of history of it, and you'll see that it's not.
Yeah. We're heading toward the end, but I have a couple more questions. One, some artistic questions, because again, I do have an artist background. I have to be honest, I never developed it to the point anywhere even close to you. I think I could have if I had stuck with it, but I kind of went down a different career path, and then it sort of ended my artistic ambitions. I'm really curious about how you use visual references, or if you do, specifically in terms of anatomy and also in terms of architecture, whether it's 3D models or just looking at things, or is your understanding of human anatomy so good that you can just draw things correct without references, or where are you at on that spectrum of using references?
I always reference, and I think generally my knowledge of anatomy is, I would say, decent enough for me to plot the pose down without making the character look completely weird. But in terms of getting the details down, sometimes I do need to get a person to pose, or like get a photo reference of a person sort of doing that thing or close to that thing, and extrapolating from it, because you're never going to find a reference that's the exact pose that you want. Just not going to happen. So it's a lot of finding various references and sort of putting it together in my head. In terms of architecture, I grew up with a lot of this stuff. So I grew up around I didn't grow up in Shanghai, but I did spend a couple of years in Shanghai, and then I go back and visit sometimes. So there's pictures from my own photo album. There's stuff that I search up online that I'll use. I prefer to use real architecture versus already existing like fantasy architecture, which is just available in droves online, because I feel like it's better to go to the source and interpret something than it is to go to something that's been interpreted and interpret that.
That makes sense. Yeah, I like that.
And so yeah, I use a ton of references. Like I will have anywhere from 5 to like 20 references for every painting. So
wow, that's a lot.
It depends on what I'm painting. If I don't really know the subject that well, I will get more references. Like let's say I'm painting, I don't know, motorcycle, and I want it to be a Harley Davidson, and I have no idea what they look like. Well, I'm gonna probably find like 10 pictures of Harley Davidsons. So,
Yeah, that totally makes sense. What about your advice for people who are wanting to follow in your footsteps, same kind of career path? I know there's a lot of aspiring artists out there. This is one of the reasons why I asked the anatomy question, just because one thing I came to believe over the years of my studying art was that I see people who are fan artists and they're pretty good, but they lack understanding of, they either lack the general understanding or they don't take the time to think about it. And so they're good at the, like, I can draw anime eyes and like I can draw cool swords or something, but without the like foundation there for it, the end result looks, you can just tell that it's not really professional. Sorry, I kind of went on a rant there. Going back to my question was for people who are aspiring artists, whether they're currently just kind of fan artists, they want to get better, or whether they're seriously thinking about pursuing it, going to school and trying to become a professional. What's your advice?
What is, geez, you're asking me for professional advice. I don't really even consider myself a pro.
You're getting there. You're charging for your work, and people are demanding that you, well, not demanding, are requesting your services. So you're getting to the professional level. Given that you are not quite yet at the full professional level, but you have been doing this for many years now, what would you say to the aspiring young person who says, I like drawing, I really want to get better, I'm thinking about doing it professionally?
I think overall it's important that you love what you do. Like, you gotta, and then you have to find a way to continue to do what you love and not get burnt out and tired of it. If that means taking regular breaks, take breaks. If that means turning off social media to like clean up your mental health and just, cleanse yourself of all the noise on Twitter and Instagram, do that. And if it means you have some kind of side project where you just draw for your own self-indulgence, then do that, because it's a long road. There's a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of things that will be frustrating, and just keep at it, but make sure you still love it. Yeah, that's probably my spiel.
Have you managed to completely avoid burnout, or have you gotten close to it, or have you actually reached points where you're just like, I'm done, I need to take an extended break?
I don't think I have, but I think I'm also kind of a workaholic. I like being busy, and I like just having something to do. So I guess that gives me a sort of a natural advantage. But I think what really helped me was, I think 2 years ago, or maybe like a year ago or something, I said to myself, look, if I'm going to be drawing something on my spare time and I'm not being paid for it, I'm going to draw it because I really, really like this thing, and not because it's popular. So that's what I did, and it's done wonders for my mental health. So yeah, just do what you love. It doesn't matter what people think is popular, what people like on the internet. Just do it for yourself, and like in the end, you will build up a following that actually likes the stuff that you're drawing, as opposed to pretending to artistically be somebody else that you're attracting the wrong fan base and they don't actually like the real stuff that you're doing. And I kind of learned that the hard way, and I still struggle with it to this day. I haven't gotten over it, but it is what it is, and I'm going to stick by my mantra and continue to draw only the things that I really, really like in my spare time.
That is some sage advice. All right, we are starting to run out of time here. So in terms of your webtoon, Chroniclers, is there an easy URL people can use to find that, or should they just Google Chroniclers, or how do they find it?
I do not have a short URL. Unfortunately, the URLs in webtoon they're very clumsy and they're huge for some reason.
Right.
I think the easiest way to find it is to go to webtoon.com or webtoons.com. And search for Chroniclers. Or if you're looking up the Chinese version, you can look up xianxia, which is the Chinese title.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming on, and it was fun picking your brain. And do you have anything else you'd like to say, or any other recommendations before we call it a day?
I really want to thank you for taking the time and taking the risk on me. And it's been a great pleasure and an honor to be on this podcast. And if you are a wuxia xianxia fan and you have not seen or read any of Jin Yong's novels, please go read them, or at least some of them. Yeah, that's what I want to end on.
All right, that is a great way to end, and I totally agree with that. I don't want to get derailed, but Xingyong was what sucked me into all of this. And if you have not, and you are into this stuff, I 100% agree. You have to go check out that. I mean, it would be like saying that, you're really into fantasy, but you had never read The Hobbit or something like that. It's just definitely required reading for sure.
Yes, very much required.
Okay, so that is it for this episode of the Asian Fantasy Fiction Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Jeremy Bai. You can check out all of my works and recommendations at my website, which is jeremybai.com. And make sure to go to webtoons.com and search for the Chroniclers. It is really beautiful and amazing stuff, and you won't regret it. That's it for this episode. I will see you next time.